Hi class, this project is our last project and it's project 8, CSS grid responsive page. This page is going to be responsive just like the Bootstrap page, but it's using a completely different method. So it's using what we call a CSS grid. And you're going to be learning about that here on page 353 in our book. So you should have created your Bootstrap responsive page. So this is another method of accomplishing the same goal, but without the underlying framework that is required for Bootstrap pages to function. So basically all you need for this one is CSS. So it uses grids to create rows and columns, a lot like Bootstrap. You can use media queries to change the grid based on the user's display size. And the grid involves an underlying column grid, which spans 12 columns. You can actually choose how many columns you want though. So the default is not 12, you have to define it as 12. And if you wanted to make it less than that, you could. So after the grid is defined, you define the size of various grid elements based on that grid. So you want to think about it as like rows and columns, like an Excel spreadsheet basically. One significant difference from Bootstrap is that the CSS grid pages keep the grid definitions entirely separate from the HTML. So this is an example. Div class call large 6, and then you close the div, okay? So that defines a div that occupies 6 columns in the underlying page grid when the display size hits the large breakpoint. In the CSS grid, the HTML code does not rely on predefined classes to determine an element's size. Instead, position and size are defined only in the CSS file. So in the HTML file, it would say div class whatever text. And then in the CSS file, it would say div text is grid column span 12. So the code defines a div with a specific class name, and then the CSS actually tells it how many columns to span in the underlying page grid. So the CSS in this example makes no mention of the display size, whereas in Bootstrap you have your default display sizes, your 5 sizes, and those are the ones that you can use. This doesn't do that. This just uses the underlying page grid and you tell it how many columns you want it to span. Then you use media queries to tell it what to do in specific situations, okay? So if you want to change the element to occupy a different space in a specific display size, you have to use a media query. So let's just say like we want this div or whatever's in this div to span the full width of the page. And so we tell it to do div text grid column span 12. So that's the full width of our page. But let's say when we go to a larger screen size, like a desktop with a minimum width of 992, then we only want this, what's in that div, to span half of the page. So it would span only 6 of the underlying grid columns. It may not seem like it's that different of a method than Bootstrap, but Bootstrap requires all of these predefined classes in a CSS page, whereas the CSS grid method does not require that. Okay, so that's kind of what's different about it. You're gonna, if you use the CSS grid method, you're gonna have two separate CSS files that are gonna manage the selectors you need. So the one will be called gridstyles.css, define the grid, and then content styles that define the appearance of things. So this is an example of a grid container. So the grid layout consists of a parent element, or the grid container, that defines rows and columns of the grid. The grid container encloses one or more child elements, or the grid items, which fill out those rows and columns. You can use any number of columns, but you should carefully consider your needs before making this decision. Using too few columns limits your flexibility, while too many columns can make your grid unnecessarily complex. So that's why most of the time people go for 12. So let's say you only wanted 3 underlying columns, because you're only going to ever have 3 columns on your page. You can do that. You can define 3 underlying columns, but using 6 would actually allow you greater flexibility in case you decide to change something based on the item content. So let's say you wanted text 2 to be just a little bit bigger than it was, like 5 columns instead of 4, then you can easily change that. So I would keep it 6 or more if you're going to be doing the underlying grid columns. Okay, so you're gonna learn a lot through here. It's gonna get a little confusing. I'll try and make a tutorial video to walk you step by step through it. The next thing we're going to talk about is web fonts. Web fonts are fonts that are accessible to you on the web already. You don't have to download them and include them in your root folder. So Adobe Edge has some web fonts which are accessible to you in Dreamweaver, and I'll show you that. So if you go to Tools and Manage Fonts, these are the Adobe Edge web fonts that you can use, and there are a lot of them, so there's probably more than you would ever need to use, but you can include those in your HTML pages, and you don't actually have to download the file. The file is actually linked to another server, an Adobe server, on your page, and so it cuts down on your file size if you want to use a really funky looking font on your website. Okay, so you can use Adobe Edge web fonts, or you can use Google Fonts, and I'll show you that. Fonts.google.com. There are like unlimited amounts of fonts here. If you have one that you want to use on your website, you don't have to download it. You can. You do have to be careful about the licensing on these because they're not all completely free. So let's just say we find one we like. Just check out the license on it. So it says these fonts are licensed under the Open Font license. You can use them freely in products and projects. However, you can't sell the fonts on their own. Okay, so this one's okay for us to use. So you could actually download it if you wanted and install it on your computer. The other option that you have is to embed it on your web page. So let's say we want this one, okay? Click on this little selected families thing, and any of the families that you have selected over here, you can review them here, and then it has the option to embed. To embed a font, copy the code into the head of your HTML. Okay, so you copy this code right here and you paste it in the head section of your document. And it will link to that Google font remotely. It's not going to download it. And then when you are in your CSS, this is the code that you use. Dosis is that one, or Roboto is the second one, okay? So it's really easy to use Google Fonts, and then if you're in Dreamweaver, you can go up to Tools and Manage Fonts. Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to talk about is adding HTML5 video. You can use the video tag to define a source for a video that will play directly on the page. And there are 3 supported video formats: MP4, WebM, and OGG. Different browsers support different formats. Notice that all the browsers support MP4. So as long as you can create a video that has MP4 as its format, you should be fine to embed it on your web page. To embed a video, you're just going to go over to the Insert panel, and you can go down to HTML5 video. It's really easy. You put your source there. If you have multiple file formats, you can have alternate sources as well. And you can tell it to autoplay, preload, loop, or muted. Want to keep your video size small enough that it can download quickly on somebody's web browser, but you want it to also be high quality. So in your video class, you should learn more about how all of that works. Okay, so this should take us through project 8, and you've completed the book after that.